Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dives. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that I think is pretty important to a lot of people,
Mm.
and that is loneliness.
Yeah.
And we actually got this great source material from one of you listeners called the LPots Discussion on Understanding Loneliness, Causes, Effects, and Solutions.
Oh, very cool.
It's an interesting piece, and I've learned a lot from it already. And one of the questions that I had right off the bat was, why do people feel
Yeah.
lonely? Why are some people lonelier than others? Is it something that you can control?
Sure. I think that's a question that a lot of people have. And it's not an easy answer. Loneliness is a really complex thing. It's a feeling, it's an emotional state. But it's also tied to our social structures and the way that society is built. So it's something that we experience as individuals, but it's also something that's kind of woven into the fabric of our world.
Yeah. And this source material goes into some of the various causes,
Mm.
and there's a pretty wide range.
Mm.
It talks about people who are actually intentionally lonely. They're seeking solitude.
Right.
There's empty nesters, elderly folks, people with disabilities, individuals who maybe don't have family, and then those who are going through those big life transitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that intentional loneliness thing is really fascinating because on the one hand, it's great to seek out solitude.
Right.
It can be really beneficial for creativity and introspection. You can do some soul searching and all that. But when you kind of swing too far on that pendulum and you're neglecting your social needs, I think that's when the problems start to arise.
Right. Everything in moderation, as they say.
Exactly.
But one of the things that this source material pointed to as maybe the most frequent, or at least the most damaging cause of loneliness, was that loss of meaningful connections and those big life transitions.
It makes sense.
And I can relate to that. Like when you move to a new city, and you don't know anyone, it's like starting from
Mhm.
scratch.
Absolutely. I mean, think about like you're graduating college, you're moving to a new city, you're starting a new job. It's like your whole social world gets flipped on its head, right?
Right.
And even if those changes are positive, it can be a really isolating experience.
I remember when I first moved across the country for a job,
Mm-hmm.
it was exhilarating,
Yeah.
but it was also terrifying at the same time because I knew like two people in the entire state. So trying to rebuild that
Yeah.
social life, that social network was like a full-time job in and of itself.
Right. And it makes you realize how important those kind of like small everyday interactions are, right? Like you pass someone on the street that you recognize, or you see the same barista at your coffee shop every morning. It's those small moments that really add up to create a sense of belonging, a sense of place in the world.
Right. So how do we combat that?
Mhm.
What can we do? How do we repair those tears in that social fabric?
Hmm.
Well, this source material has some really practical tips
That's good.
for avoiding loneliness.
Love it. Practical tips.
And it kind of sounds obvious, but one of the big things that this piece talks about is building your social network.
Oh, okay.
And it sounds like, well, duh, but,
Right.
sure.
Especially when you're going through those life transitions, like we were just talking about. It can be tough to put yourself out there. I know a lot of people who struggle with it, especially as we get older.
It's like that saying, if you want to make friends, be a friend.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you be a friend when you're in a new place
Yeah.
and you're starting from scratch?
Exactly. Well, one way is to find communities that really resonate with your interests. Join a book club. Take a cooking class. Volunteer for a cause you're passionate about. When you're engaged in activities you enjoy, it's a lot easier to connect with people who share those interests.
Right. And that's what this source material talks about. It's about
Yeah.
finding those shared passions. And I can speak to that personally because a few years ago, I joined a local writing group.
Cool.
And it's completely transformed my experience living in this city.
That's awesome.
Not only did it help me grow as a writer, but I met some of my closest friends through that group.
That's awesome.
It's amazing how when you have that shared passion, that shared interest,
Yeah.
it creates such a strong bond. The research actually shows that these kinds of groups can really give you a sense of belonging and purpose.
Yeah.
And that can be incredibly powerful in combating loneliness. It's not just about how many people you know, but the quality of those connections.
Right.
Having a few close friends who you can really rely on is more valuable than having hundreds of superficial acquaintances.
Right. But even maintaining those existing relationships can be tricky.
It is.
Sometimes life just gets in the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in today's world, it's so easy to get caught up in the hustle and bustle of everyday life, and sometimes we let those important connections slip through the cracks.
So what can we do about that? Well, first of all, acknowledge that it takes effort to maintain those relationships. Just like anything else that's important to us, we have to make time for it. Schedule regular calls with your friends and family, even if it's just a quick check-in. Send a thoughtful text or email, and try to make time for face-to-face interactions whenever possible. Those little things really go a long way.
Right. It's about making it a priority, even when it feels like there's not enough time in the day.
Hmm.
And you know what? The source material also mentions staying active. And I'm not even talking about like going to the gym necessarily,
Yeah.
but just engaging in hobbies, taking walks in nature, just having those activities that give you a sense of routine and purpose,
Yeah,
especially when you're feeling a little lost or disconnected.
right.
Those things can be really grounding.
It's about creating a structure for your day, filling it with things that bring you joy and connect you with the world around you.
And, you know, I think the source specifically mentions hobbies as a really great way to combat loneliness because you're doing something you enjoy. And it also has the potential for social interaction, especially if you join a group or a class related to that hobby.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so we've talked about building and maintaining those connections, staying active, finding that sense of purpose. But what happens when those feelings of loneliness just kind of creep in,
Right.
even when we're doing everything right?
Yeah, that happens. It's like you're doing all the things you're supposed to be doing, but you still feel that pang of loneliness. It can be really frustrating.
Is there anything we can do to kind of soften the blow, to just make it a little less painful?
Definitely. The source offers some strategies for minimizing those negative impacts of loneliness, and one of the most important and often overlooked is self-care.
Self-care, yeah. It's like the buzzword that we hear everywhere.
It's everywhere, but I think people sometimes misunderstand what it really means. It's not just about bubble baths and face masks, although those can be nice too.
Right.
It's about consciously making choices that nourish your mind, your body, and your soul. It can be something as simple as going for a walk in nature, cooking a healthy meal, listening to your favorite music, or spending time with loved ones.
I'm a big believer in the power of small acts of self-kindness. I remember going through a particularly lonely time after a breakup, and I was just neglecting my basic needs. Eating junk food, not sleeping enough, isolating myself from friends. It was a recipe for disaster.
It sounds like it.
But once I started incorporating even just small acts of self-care into my routine, like taking a short walk each day, it really made a world of difference.
And that's a perfect example of how those small changes can really add up and have ripple effect on your well-being. When you take care of yourself, you're better equipped to deal with challenges.
Right. And, you know, another thing that the source talks about is adopting a pet.
Oh, I love pets.
I mean-
They're the best.
Pets offer that incredible companionship
They do.
and unconditional love, you know, and for some people, that can really make a huge difference.
I agree. While it's important to remember that pet ownership is a big responsibility, studies have shown that for a lot of people, having a furry companion can really help alleviate feelings of loneliness. It gives them a sense of purpose and routine. Plus, caring for a pet often encourages people to adopt healthier habits like daily walks and playtime.
Right. So you're not just
Yeah.
benefiting from the companionship, you're getting a little exercise too.
A win-win.
So it's a win-win. But let's shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about individual strategies for combating loneliness.
Yeah.
What about the bigger picture? What about addressing loneliness on a societal level? What can we do as a collective to tackle this?
It's a great question, and it's something the source really dives into. One thing that stood out to me was the idea of fostering more inclusive communities.
Yeah.
We need to create spaces and opportunities for people to connect, regardless of their age, their background, or their interests.
What kind of spaces are we talking about? Like, give me some
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah. Think libraries, parks, community gardens, places where people can just gather organically, share experiences, and build those informal connections. It's all about ensuring these spaces are accessible and welcoming to everyone.
Right. It's like creating those third places, you know, not home, not work, but those spaces where people can come together and just be themselves.
Exactly.
And, you know, there are actually some really cool initiatives out there that are doing this. I was reading about this amazing project in a small town where they transformed an abandoned warehouse into a community arts center. It's become this vibrant hub where people of all ages come to paint, dance, make music, and connect.
That's so cool.
It's really transformed the social fabric of that town.
That's incredible. It just shows how A little creativity and community effort can make a real difference.
Right. But, we can't ignore the elephant in the room technology. It plays a huge role in our lives. But how is it impacting loneliness?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Technology is a double-edged sword when it comes to loneliness. On one hand, we have all these amazing tools for connecting with people across the globe. Social media, video calls, it's incredible. But on the other hand, there's a growing concern that this constant connectivity is actually making us feel more isolated and disconnected.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with
Right.
images of other people's seemingly perfect lives on social media. And it's easy to fall into that trap of comparison and envy. And sometimes, even when we're surrounded by people online, it can feel like we're completely alone.
It's true. And then there's the issue of the superficiality of those online connections. It's easy to accumulate hundreds of friends on social media. But how many of those relationships are truly meaningful? How many people can you actually turn to when you're struggling, when you need a shoulder to cry on or someone to celebrate with?
It's like we're trading depth for breadth.
Exactly.
We're sacrificing those deep, intimate bonds that provide true emotional support for a wider network of fleeting connections.
Right.
So how do we navigate this digital landscape without losing sight of our very real need for genuine human connection?
It's a challenge, but I think being mindful of how we use technology is a good place to start. Make sure to prioritize face-to-face interactions whenever possible, and be deliberate about engaging in activities that nurture real-world connections. Remember, technology is a tool, and it should enhance our social lives, not replace them.
Right. It's about recognizing that while technology can be a powerful tool for connection, it's not a substitute for the richness and complexity of human interaction.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So welcome back to our deep dive into loneliness. And before the break, we were talking about how loneliness isn't just, a feeling or an emotion, but that it can actually have real, tangible effects on our well-being.
Right. And we're talking about both physical and mental health here.
Exactly. It's like a hidden epidemic, silently affecting so many people.
So what does the research actually say about the impact of loneliness on our health?
Well, there's a growing body of evidence that links chronic loneliness to an increased risk of all sorts of health problems.
Like what?
We're talking cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, even a weakened immune system. It's kind of alarming when you think about it.
So loneliness can actually make us physically sick.
It can.
How does that even work? I mean, is it like our bodies are constantly in this state of high alert, even when there's no real danger present?
That's a great way to put it. When we experience prolonged loneliness, our bodies go into this sort of chronic stress response. It's like our ancient survival mechanisms are misfiring, perceiving isolation as a threat, even though there's no saber-toothed tiger lurking in the bushes.
So instead of a saber-toothed tiger, it's the fear of being alone that's triggering this stress response.
Exactly.
That's fascinating and a little bit unsettling, to be honest. So what's happening in our bodies during this chronic stress response?
Well, when we feel isolated or disconnected, our bodies pump out these stress hormones like cortisol. And over time, this constant state of heightened stress can really wreak havoc on our bodily systems. It leads to inflammation, higher blood pressure, and other physiological changes that make us more vulnerable to disease.
So it's like our bodies are stuck in this fight or flight mode, but there's nowhere to run, nothing to fight.
Right.
I imagine this chronic stress also takes a toll on our mental health.
Oh, absolutely. Loneliness is strongly linked to an increased risk of depression, anxiety, even suicidal thoughts. When we feel isolated, our sense of self-worth can plummet, and that can lead to some pretty negative thought patterns and a sense of hopelessness.
There's a vicious cycle, right? Loneliness breeds negativity, which just fuels more loneliness.
Exactly.
But why are we, as humans, so profoundly affected by social isolation? I mean, we're not the only social species on the planet, but we seem particularly sensitive to this feeling of disconnection.
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what makes us human. You see, from an evolutionary standpoint, our need for connection is deeply ingrained. For our ancestors, belonging to a tribe, to a group, was essential for survival. Those who were ostracized or isolated were much more vulnerable to predators, starvation, you name it.
So basically, our brains are wired to crave connection because, for our ancestors, it was literally a matter of life or death.
Exactly. Those social bonds provided safety, shared resources, support in raising offspring. So over thousands of years, those who were better at forming and maintaining social connections were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. That's how this predisposition towards sociality became embedded in our biology.
Wow, that's incredible. Makes you realize that this need for connection isn't just some fluffy feel-good notion. It's like literally woven into the fabric of our being. But how does this ancient wiring show up in our brains today? Are there specific areas of the brain that are involved in processing those feelings of loneliness?
Researchers are still trying to unravel all the complexities of the so-called lonely brain, but they have identified several key areas that seem to play a role. One is the default mode network.
Okay, the default mode network.
It's a network of brain regions that are active when we're at rest, not focused on some specific task.
Okay, so we've all got this default mode network humming away in our brains. What's it connection loneliness? Does it go into overdrive when we're feeling isolated?
Studies have shown that when people are feeling lonely, their default mode network does become more active. And what's really interesting is that this network is also involved in self-reflection, in social cognition, thinking about the past and the future.
So it's like when we're lonely, our brains get stuck in this loop, replaying past social interactions, maybe worrying about future ones, kind of like a broken record of social anxiety.
That's a great analogy. It's like our brains are desperately trying to make sense of our social situations, searching for explanations for why we feel so isolated. And in the absence of those real-world connections, that internal chatter just amplifies those feelings of loneliness.
That makes a lot of sense. Any other brain regions involved in this loneliness puzzle?
Yes, the anterior cingulate cortex.
Okay.
This area is involved in processing both physical and emotional pain. And research has shown that it lights up when people experience social rejection or exclusion, just like it would if they were experiencing physical pain.
Wait, so our brains are literally registering social pain as physical pain?
It appears so, which really underscores just how deeply social isolation can affect us. It's not just a matter of feeling sad or blue. It's a deeply ingrained biological response, like a primal alarm bell going off in our brains, signaling that something is wrong.
So if loneliness is so deeply rooted in our biology, does that mean it's something we're destined to struggle with? Are some people just wired to be more lonely than others?
That's where the research on genetics and loneliness comes in. Scientists are looking into whether certain genes might make some individuals more susceptible to feeling isolated. It's not about being born lonely, but rather having different social needs and sensitivities based on our unique genetic makeup.
So some people might have a lower threshold for social stimulation, needing more frequent interactions to feel connected, while others might be perfectly content with fewer, more intimate connections.
Exactly. And understanding these individual differences is going to be crucial for developing effective loneliness interventions. It suggests that a one-size-fits-all approach might not be the most helpful, and that we need to tailor our support based on individual needs.
That makes a lot of sense. But I have to ask, with all the technological advancements we're seeing, do you think loneliness is going to become a bigger problem in the future?
The million-dollar question. Technology is such a double-edged sword when it comes to loneliness. On the one hand, it offers these incredible opportunities for connection. We can communicate with people across the globe, find online communities based on shared interests. But on the other hand, there's a growing worry that our increasing reliance on technology might actually be fueling a sense of isolation and disconnect.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with these curated images of other people's seemingly perfect lives on social media. And it's easy to get sucked into that comparison game, that feeling of envy. And sometimes, even when we're surrounded by people online, it can still feel like we're totally alone.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of depth, or lack thereof. It's so easy to rack up hundreds of online friends, but how many of those connections are truly meaningful? How many people do we feel comfortable turning to when we're really struggling, when we need a shoulder to cry on or a listening ear?
It's like we're trading depth for breadth, sacrificing those deep, intimate bonds that offer real emotional support for this wider network of more fleeting connections. So how do we navigate this digital world without losing sight of that fundamental human need for genuine connection?
That's the challenge, isn't it? The source material suggests that we need to be more mindful of how we use technology, prioritizing face-to-face interactions whenever possible, and making a conscious effort to engage in activities that foster real-world connections. It's about finding that balance between the virtual world and the real world, and remembering that technology should be a tool to enhance our social lives, not replace them.
Right. Recognizing that while technology can be a great way to connect, it's not a substitute for that richness and complexity of human interaction. All right, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've gone pretty deep into this whole topic of loneliness, the causes, the effects, even the brain science behind it. Wow, it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is.
But I'm kind of curious, like, where do we go from here? What can we actually do about this feeling of isolation, both as individuals and as a society?
Well, it's a tough question, no doubt, but this source material that we've been looking at, it does offer some interesting solutions. One that really caught my eye was this idea of social prescribing.
Social prescribing. I'm not sure I've heard of that before.
So picture this. You go to the doctor, right? And you're feeling down, maybe isolated, and instead of just giving you a prescription for meds, they refer you to, say, a community garden or a walking group, maybe even a volunteer organization.
Huh.
Yeah, that's basically what social prescribing is, connecting people with non-medical support in their communities, to address those social factors that can really impact our well-being.
So it's recognizing that our health isn't just about physical symptoms, it's also about our social connections and how connected we feel. I
Exactly.
like that.
It's like prescribing connection as a form of medicine. And what's really cool is that social prescribing can be so personalized. It's all about empowering folks to take an active role in their own well-being, finding activities they enjoy and that help them connect with others. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
It makes me think about how we tend to put our health into these separate boxes, physical health, mental health, social health, when really they're all intertwined.
Yeah, they are.
So are there any other initiatives or programs that are trying to address loneliness from that more holistic perspective?
Oh, yeah. Tons. There are all sorts of innovative programs out there. One that I find particularly cool is intergenerational programs.
Oh,
These bring together people from different age groups, for shared activities, learning experiences, and of course, social connection.
I love that idea of bringing different generations together. What sorts of activities are we talking about?
Oh, it can vary. Could be mentoring programs where seniors share their wisdom and experiences with younger folks, or maybe it's shared art projects or community gardening. The main thing is creating those opportunities for interaction, fostering that sense of connection across different generations.
Yeah, breaking down those age barriers and creating communities where everyone feels valued and connected.
Exactly.
I love it. But it
Yeah,
doesn't always have to be a formal program, right? Just those small, everyday interactions can make a difference too.
absolutely. Just striking up a conversation with your neighbor, checking in on an elderly relative, offering to help someone with their groceries, those little things can create a ripple effect of connection in your community.
It's empowering to know that we don't have to wait for some big initiative to make a difference. We can take action ourselves
We can.
right here, right now.
Exactly. And the source material that we've been looking at, it really stresses the power of grassroots movements, those community-led projects in fighting back against loneliness. And of course, it also emphasizes how important it is to just educate people about loneliness, break down the stigma, and encourage open conversations.
Right, we need to create a culture where it's okay to say, hey, I'm feeling lonely, to reach out for help without feeling like you're a burden. It's about shifting the narrative from shame and secrecy to one of understanding and support.
And sometimes the most powerful tool we have is just storytelling. Sharing our own experiences with loneliness, listening to the stories of others, it can be so validating and help us realize that we're not alone in these feelings.
It's like those stories create this sense of shared humanity, reminding us that even when we're in those dark moments, there's always hope and the possibility of connection. Reminds me of the story I read about this woman who was feeling super isolated after moving to a new city. She decided to start this conversation cafe in her local park. She just set up a table with a sign and said, come have a chat, and she'd offer free tea and coffee.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Right. At first, she thought no one would show up. But then people from all walks of life started gathering at her table, sharing stories, laughing, offering support, and forming those real connections. Just that simple act of creating a space for conversation really made a difference in her community. It's a reminder that even the smallest gestures can have a big impact.
It really is inspiring, isn't it? And it really drives home the message that tackling loneliness is an ongoing process, a collective effort that takes patience, compassion, and a willingness to, just try new things. There will be setbacks, of course, but the key is to keep reaching out, keep nurturing those connections, and never give up hope on finding that sense of belonging.
Never give up on connection. That's so important. We've covered so much in this deep dive. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that loneliness is complex, sure, but it's not insurmountable. There's hope, there are solutions, and there's a whole movement of people and communities out there dedicated to creating a more connected world.
Couldn't agree more. It's been fantastic exploring this topic with you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, remember, you are not alone in this journey. We are all in this together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into loneliness. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration.